I suppose that history will remember my term as the years when the Cold War began to overshadow our lives. And always in the background, there has been the atomic bomb.
After untold human misery, after the slaughter of more than 20 million people in Europe alone, the war that Hitler unleashed, the war that lasted 5.5 agonizing years, was coming to an end. At Yalta, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in early 1945, the question was whether antagonisms of nations and ideologies could be set aside. Could there be a rebirth of civilization? In the Pacific, hard fighting lay ahead for the final assault on Japan, still ruled by unyielding militarists. After victory in war, would the Allied leaders find the key to peace?
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin from CBS World News. A press association has just announced that President Roosevelt is dead.
I, Harry S. Truman, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office.
When Franklin Roosevelt died, I felt there must be 1 million men better qualified than I to take up the presidential task. But the work was mine to do, and I had to do it, and I've tried to give it everything that is in me.
He was born on a Missouri farm. Then his family moved to town. By the age of 10, he had read every public library, especially the history books. To tease him, the other kids called him Four Eyes because he wore glasses. The main reason you read a book, he said, is to get a better insight into the people you're talking to. In World War I, he was an artillery officer on the battlefields of France, remembered by his men as a hard taskmaster, but also a true friend. He knew their strength and their weaknesses, and he knew that war was hell on a soldier. His men remained loyal to him for life, and he to them. Back in Missouri after the war, he failed when he set up a haberdashery store. It took him years, but he insisted on paying his debts to the last penny. When he entered local politics, he became known as an honest, forthright man in such elective offices as county judge, in charge, among other things, of road building contracts where corruption had until then been taken for granted. The simple truth as I saw it, he said, was that the country should be run for the people's benefit, not for the special crew who has the inside track. He said, when I came to the point of expending great amounts of public money for contracts, it was openly done with all the figures shown, and the lowest bidder got the contract. Twice elected to the United States Senate, he came to public attention as chairman of the Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program. He uncovered waste, inefficiency, and fraud in defense contracts, saved millions of taxpayer dollars, and took pride in getting 2 corrupt generals off to jail. In January 1945, he was sworn in as vice president in an austere wartime ceremony on the south portico of the White House. At their only meeting, President Roosevelt urged his vice president not to travel by air. One of us, he said, has to stay alive. At the death of the president, Harry Truman knew what had to be done.
I call upon all Americans to help me keep our nation united in defense of those ideals which have been so eloquently proclaimed by Franklin Roosevelt. For the benefit of all, every individual must do his duty. Both Germany and Japan can be certain, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that America will continue the fight for freedom until no vestige of resistance remains.
At San Francisco, the search for peace would take place. 50 governments would meet here to draft the Charter of the United Nations. From his knowledge of history, President Truman was aware of the fact that often through the centuries, wartime allies had turned against each other after their common victory. He also remembered the price nations must pay when they pursue narrowly selfish policies without regard to a larger common goal.
If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace. We must make certain, by your work here, that another world war will be impossible.
During the final drive that smashed the power of Nazi Germany in the spring of '45, Truman's thoughts went to his predecessor, the architect of Allied victory.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe. I only wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to witness this day.
When the Allied leaders met at Potsdam, both the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and Britain's Prime Minister Churchill at first underestimated the new American president. But they soon learned that this unprepossessing man from Missouri was shrewd, direct, and unafraid. It was here that Truman first learned of America's successful secret test of the atomic bomb in the Nevada desert. He informed Marshal Stalin, who gave the appearance of being unimpressed. For Truman, it raised a political and moral dilemma, such as few men have had to face. It was a weapon of awesome destructiveness, a cruel weapon that would shock the world. Before and after the test, scientists had warned of the danger of atomic fallout and radiation lethal to all living things. The war in the Pacific was still being pursued with unrelenting fury. Japan had vowed it would never surrender. Its people would fight to the last man. Allied and Japanese forces were locked in a deadly struggle. The estimate was that 500,000 men on each side would be killed in the assault on Japan. Leaflets scattered over the Japanese islands gave warning of the existence of the terrible new weapon now in the hands of the Americans. The militarist government chose to ignore the warning. As for the people, they had no choice in the matter of surrender. On his return from Potsdam, President Truman received word that the Japanese had rejected the ultimatum for surrender. The decision was up to the president. He considered that there was no alternative but to use the bomb. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay flew the fateful mission. Its target, a city whose name was until then not known to the world, Hiroshima. Some scientists had urged that the bomb be dropped on an uninhabited region, but this was not judged a suitable plan for ending the war. In Hiroshima, 70,000 people perished in one single terrifying flash.
The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans. We shall continue to use it until we completely destroy Japan's power to make war.
No message of surrender having been received after the bombing of Hiroshima, a second bomb was dropped, this time on the city of Nagasaki. President Truman remained steadfast in his belief that it had been the only if tragic way of ending the conflict. In pain, suffering, and destruction, the atomic age was born on those two earth-shaking days in August 1945. The Japanese militarists still wanted to fight to the finish, but Emperor Hirohito saw the devastation with his own eyes, and in his own voice he broadcast the message of surrender.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
Although Japan did surrender unconditionally to General Douglas MacArthur in a formal ceremony aboard the USS Missouri, the United States helped the defeated country rebuild its cities and factories, and 30 years later, Japan ranked as one of the 4 leading industrial powers of the world. No one who has lived through years of combat in faraway lands will ever recall without deep emotion the moment of his homecoming. But for the returning servicemen and for the nation, there were to be serious problems of readjustment to peacetime. President Truman saw that housing was a priority requirement. He put through a program for 1.5 million new homes a year. To stem the tide of inflation, he asked for wartime price controls to be continued, but met with opposition in Congress.
Days of inflation are continuing to grow. The cost of living is continuing to rise. I've been urging price control because it is a realistic way, a tested way, of holding down the cost of living.
Labor demanded increases to meet the high cost of living. Strikes were called. In May 1946, a nationwide railroad stoppage, following on the heels of a coal strike, threatened to shut down all major industries. The nation was virtually coming to a standstill. The president had to act. Harry Truman did not hesitate for a moment.
I request the Congress immediately to authorize the president to draft into the armed forces of the United States all workers who are on strike against their government. Word has just been received that the rail strike has been settled on terms proposed by the president.
The Taft-Hartley Act was introduced in the Republican-controlled 80th Congress. It sought to modify previous labor laws. Supporters claimed it put the employer on an equal footing with labor in bargaining sessions. Critics called it union busting. President Truman vetoed the bill.
I vetoed the Taft-Hartley bill because I'm convinced it is a bad bill. It is bad for labor, bad for management, bad for the country.
The Congress voted to override the veto, and it was signed into law in June 1947. It became an important issue in the presidential election campaign the following year. There were issues of even greater political and humanitarian concern. In the war-devastated nations of Europe and Asia, millions of displaced persons had to be fed, clothed, and housed. Through the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA, people and nations on the brink of destitution and chaos were given new sustenance and hope. President Truman will be remembered for his leadership in these and other post-war humanitarian relief programs.
Our program of foreign aid is perhaps the greatest venture in constructive statesmanship that any nation has undertaken. It is an outstanding example of cooperative endeavor for the common good. This measure is America's answer to the challenge facing the free world today.
Those chaotic post-war years created a political challenge of major proportions. One after another, nations of Eastern Europe came under communist domination, in effect became satellites of the Soviet Union. In 1947, it became apparent that two nations of great strategic importance, Greece and Turkey, were about to become the latest victims of Soviet domination. In Greece, a civil war had been growing more intense every year. In 1947, the elected government was under military attack by communist forces supplied by neighboring communist states. President Truman saw it as a situation that could not be tolerated.
Should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the west as well as to the east. We must take immediate and resolute action.
Action was taken. Greece and Turkey were given $400 million worth of agricultural supplies, road-building equipment, and technical know-how. Military equipment rolled in vast quantities. Greece and Turkey were able to stand up to the Soviet challenge. In Greece and Turkey, President Truman said, "We put the world on notice that we would support the cause of freedom wherever it was threatened." In the years following the end of the World War in 1945, Europe was a scene of devastation. The question was, could this once great center of industry and civilization be restored to its former productivity and affluence? It seemed a hopeless proposition. President Truman and his Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, rose to the challenge. In what was to become known as the Marshall Plan, the United States would help Europe rebuild.
It is logical that the United States should do whatever it is able to do to assist in the return of normal economic health in the world. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos, so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist.
The Marshall Plan cost many billions of dollars, but it succeeded beyond expectation in restoring the economic and political vitality of free Europe. And for Western Europe to become once more productive and free was in America's own interest. These bold initiatives by President Truman threw the Soviets into a political panic. On June 26, 1948, they suddenly imposed a blockade, isolating the city of West Berlin deep inside communist East Germany. The world looked to President Truman for a response. The response came from the sky. For 1 year, West Berlin was supplied entirely by air. He had had several options. He could have given in to Soviet demands, or he could have challenged Soviet forces on the ground. The Berlin airlift was a bold, imaginative move. It was presidential leadership at its best.
There are times in world history when it is far wiser to act than to hesitate. There is some risk involved in action. There always is. But there is far more risk in failure to act.
Faced with such a show of determination, the East Germans yielded and lifted the blockade 1 year later. In West Berlin, Harry S. Truman made his decision. He knew he was right, and he never gave it another thought. That was the kind of president he was, and even the other side came to respect him for it.